Tracy, we're back here again. We're
Yes.
retaping the interview. Had some technical issues
Right.
the last time, so we are going to post the audio of the other one.
Oh, okay.
So that way,
Everything
there's
is
no
out there.
discrepancies,
Yes.
and just making sure we get this on tape since
Right.
everybody else is having the tape.
Very good.
All right. So could you give me a little bit background on yourself and kind of your history in the district and personal history?
Sure. I grew up in Rochester in the city. My father had a restaurant there for 50 years downtown, and I worked there a lot when I was a teenager and young adult. I went to university in Rochester, at the University of Rochester, and then in 1981 moved to Binghamton, Johnson City, and Endicott area when I was in graduate school for a doctorate in American history. I taught at University of Buffalo, Keuka College, Ithaca College, and Cornell University. And then in 1992, went to Cornell Law School
Okay.
and graduated in 1995 from there. Taught some more, practiced a little bit of law, had a family, raised my family here in Ithaca. And then in 2001, took on the directorship of IT policy at Cornell University and did that for about 13 years. I was out on my own for a couple of years with a consulting firm, and in the course of that, at the University of Massachusetts, I took on a deanship to create a cybersecurity certificate program, which we did and have now put online, so I've retired that role. And now I'm still doing some work for them, as well as taking the interim director of the Executive Master's Program at Ithaca College.
All right, and I am currently at Ithaca College, so just the full disclosure there.
Very good, yes.
So public policy background. I know you mentioned you were on the planning board, or the board?
I was. For 10 years, I was on the town planning board, and it was a fantastic experience to get to know people in the community, some of the issues, land use issues that I didn't have much experience with prior to that. So yes, I did that for 10 years.
Yeah. Other ways of public service?
Well, I was a trustee for the Tompkins County Library. When I began working extensively in Massachusetts, I let someone else take that role. And what else have I done in the community? You know, I practiced law for a while, and mostly it was assigned counsel. And at the rate that was being paid, that you might as well call that community service too. But that was a great experience to get to know other aspects of the community and its needs, the judicial system, the Tompkins County Bar Association, and so forth. Yeah.
So you're eyeing up a run for Congress. The technical designation is exploring a candidacy?
Yes, as I
Correct.
understand it, I'm in the phase of exploring a candidacy for the U.S. Representative Office, 23rd District.
So what brought you from your background and everything else, long list, to Congress?
Well, I've always had an interest in politics, and if you knew me back in college, you might have thought I would have gone into politics directly. But I fell in love with the study of history, and I had a transformative experience in higher education. I was a student leader, and I saw that you can accomplish change from the inside. And that was very meaningful to me. So I embarked on a career of working in higher education administration, and hence the law school. I actually did not go to law school to be an attorney per se, although I benefited from some practice for a few years. But I did go in order to be a better administrator. And I accomplished that goal, but I find myself now in a situation where the circumstances of politics today and where I am in my life might be an opportunity to see if I can make a contribution.
So looking forward, what are your, just a general question, what is your basis for the job of a congressman? What are the requirements for anybody to be a congressman?
Well,
besides the age requirements, things like that.
Yes, constitutional requirements, basic integrity, an interest in politics and policy, and by that I mean that you understand how a democratic republic works, what the role of public service is, and you have some facility for discerning what the needs of your community are. I mean, really, that is what policy is. You try to understand what a need is and what are the best solutions to addressing that need. And so I think those would be the very basic requirements that anyone should have going into politics today. Why I think of myself for a congressional role and not local politics is a combination of the work that I've done in policy, both in teaching as well as in practice, the work that I've done in internet policy in particular, which is a dire need for this community as well as for the country, and all of the other issues that stem out from that, economic competition, innovation, jobs, privacy, security. You can see a lot of general policy through the lens of internet and internet policy, and that's what I've been doing now for 15 years. And I think that we need to be thinking of ourselves in those terms as we move forward into the 21st century.
Absolutely. So I do want to take some time and just go through one by one a bunch of different policy areas.
Sure.
And we'll just keep hitting those as much as we can get through.
Sounds great, Vaughn.
All right. So the first one, environment. First of all, climate change.
Climate
Does
change,
it exist? And if so, what are some ways you would see of possibly mitigating that issue, keeping in mind the rest of the district?
Yes. I think it's almost unequivocal that climate change is occurring. I think we get ourselves wrapped around the axle too much of exactly why. I'm not a scientist, but my understanding of it is probably a combination of elements contributed by humanity and industrialization and CO2 levels and so forth, as well as what are probably climate changes that occur all the time. I mean, anyone who knows just the basics of geology and climate know that we've had ice ages, hence we have this beautiful lake here. And it may be that the activities of humans are rapidly accelerating those changes. What we do know is we need to address them in any variety of ways. So for reasons of environmental sustainability, but also reasons for things including national security, we should be energy independent of the rest of the world. It's very unfortunate when we find ourselves having to compromise the integrity of this country and our national security because we are dependent on other energy sources outside of our country. And I think the way to go with that is certainly renewable energies. That isn't to stop fossil fuel energies tomorrow morning, but it is to broaden our portfolio, let's say, as to what the opportunities are. Moreover, I think there are great opportunities for scientific innovation and discovery and research for renewable energies. That's still a moving target. And manufacturing. We should be building these energies in this country, and the 23rd District would be a great place to do it. And not in places like China, that has absolutely taken off in this area. The hydraulic fracking that is so particularly an issue in this area, my position is that until at least three things change, I am supportive of President Cuomo's moratorium. The three things would be scientific research that would suggest that the chemicals used would no longer be harmful to people. I understand it has a terrific harm to the nervous system and other medical issues involved in the health area. I think we would want to have better engineering than we have had, and then certainly the whole process of the containment and how they're neutralizing the chemicals and so forth, that seems very imperfect. And the third area would be that it is not under the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And that was a very clever trick, I think, that the fossil fuel industry did, knowing that they had this process in their portfolio moving forward. They managed to pass legislation that had a protection from the EPA for this particular method, and so it's not regulated. And in order for me to even begin to think about the possibility of having that happen in this district, I think it really would require the appropriate kind of regulation that might build in some of these other issues, the medical as well as the engineering.
All right, moving on to Second Amendment rights.
Yes.
Gun ownership is a very personal issue in many areas across the district and across the country.
Yes.
How do you feel about gun control, and where on the spectrum do you lie?
I do believe that there can be responsible gun ownership of appropriate kinds of guns. And by that I mean for hunting. I mean, my father used to go duck hunting down in the Dansville area. All of his brothers hunted. I've inherited my father and my grandfather's guns. I appreciate that is a sport, and I think actually we could add that on productively to our tourism trade here in this area, based on some of the experiences, even just that my family had. So I do believe in gun ownership, but I think it is something that needs to be balanced with the other needs of a society and community. So, for example, I don't believe that hunters need automatic weapons. And I think that we take so many individual right issues and we balance the needs of the community with the needs of the individual. And that's something that we can do with gun control too.
All right, and another issue, the economy. So looking at it from a macro sense, the economy is a very complicated beast.
Yes.
There's no way we can solve economic policy sitting here today. But looking at it from a macro sense, how do you feel generally of ways that we could present reforms that would benefit the people back here in the district?
Right. Well, first of all, connected with economic issues, I think you introduced the word macro.
Yeah.
So if I were to look at the country as well as the district and say what is the largest macro issue that has us in something of an odd stall economically, that is, we have low unemployment, but we have very poor wage levels. We have underemployment. And we certainly have problems with our economy that can't be addressed just by looking at the employment levels right now. I would say that the main problem, the macro problem, is the way taxes have been structured since the 1980s. There are many studies that demonstrate that the enormous amount of wealth has been acquired by the 1% of Americans in this country. And that is really not what the United States has ever been about. It's been about social mobility, it's been about upward mobility. And to have policies that are skewed away from where the culture lies has been a very unfortunate development, I would say, in the last 30, 40, 50 years of this country. And it is time for that to change. If we begin to change our tax structure in such a way that supports the middle class instead of burdening them, we create an opportunity where we can move money into directions where we could create economic zones. We can have tax credits for areas that we need. Anything from an individual needing health care would be a good area for some tax abatement, as well as child care for young families. As well as economic readiness zones and how we can spur on the economy and offering opportunity to manufacturing, especially in a state that state-wise has a very heavy tax burden. So if we could free up that money that has been sucked up into that 1%, we have a lot of creativity available to us as to how we can re-gear things. And from the perspective of the working class, the middle class is an ideal. Sure, we would all love to go from rags to riches, as the Horatio Alger idea is. But the reality is most people just want to be middle class. Yeah. And that's what's burdened right now. And that burden is what we have to lift, not only for the middle class, but also for the responsibilities of the very wealthy to give back to this country, which they're not doing. Supply-side economics has been only partially successful, and now I think it has a harmful effect on us. And that middle-class perspective is really good, I think, for the working class to have something to be able to move up to.
So what are some specific ways you would, or parts you would implement to the tax code as it exists, or parts that you would remove from the tax code that would create that mobility?
Sure. Some examples would be, first of all, I think that the very wealthy simply need to be taxed more and not have the deductions available to them to avoid that kind of taxation. When my father passed away, for example, because of an insurance settlement, the estate went over the estate tax number by a few $1,000s. I don't remember the exact number. But that was at a level of, I think, about $695,000. The tax on that at that time was 45%. So almost all the money that had come to my father as the result of an insurance settlement about my mother's medical malpractice that took her life was absorbed into those taxes. A year after that, President Bush at that time eliminated that tax. I mean, to have these fluctuations doesn't seem to make sense. We need to establish something that is going to bring the money back down from that 1% back into society. We have to have tax credits such as, I think, tuition, college tuition should be deductible. If we're going to have a system with deductions, let's give those deductions to working and middle class people. Mm-hmm. I think interest, by the way, on student loans should not exist. Yeah. I believe the government can absorb the administrative costs, and that is the way that we can support higher education. Mm-hmm. If we're talking about college-age students, by the way, I also believe in an 18-year-old drinking age. But to go back to your question about, I think the tax credits for development such as renewable energies, bringing manufacturing to the degree that it still exists, and it's going to be more automated, we know that, but there's still an element of how you produce things. We can create tax-free zones or tax credit zones for new manufacturers coming into this area, the research and development. And I think the thing that I would preference the most would be public-private partnerships. Mm-hmm. A lot of money is in private hands now, whether it's corporate or individual. Yeah. And for those that have that ability to be able to put them back into civil society with the goals of creating a balanced government, a balanced economy, I think private-public partnerships is a very creative way for us to go.
Mm-hmm. And I want to touch on it there. You said an 18-year-old drinking age?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you explain that a little?
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned my father had a restaurant, so yeah. and we were Italian on my father's side. So I grew up with wine at the table from when I was 8, 9 years old. And, you know, I served bar at my father's restaurant from when I was 13. Mm-hmm. In other words, alcohol was not a forbidden fruit for me. And I learned how to drink it fairly responsibly. Yeah. You know, there were times in college and so forth. But I brought my children up in the same way. Mm-hmm. I don't want them to think that alcohol is a forbidden fruit, that then they go on to college, have access to it, which we know it's ubiquitously available in colleges, notwithstanding that drink-wood age. Absolutely it is. That was for your parents, you said that, didn't you? That then a person indulges, they don't know how to handle it, they don't know the proof levels of different kinds of alcohol, if it's a beer or if it's, you know, a bourbon. Mm-hmm. And then they find themselves in, you know, some very scary, if not lethal situations. Mm-hmm. I believe that the 18-year-old age is appropriate for American society. Mm-hmm. 21 is far too extended. And insurance companies are the ones that have majorly pushed the pen of our legislatures to make that uniform for all of the country that went into transportation law. That's how it all got there. And I know that there are parents who are very concerned about drunk driving. I'm very harsh on drunk driving. It really should be addressed. Certainly, to say the lowering of the drinking age isn't a license to drive while inebriated. But I think we have to recognize there are a lot of parents suffering now because their children have died as the result of drinking, or have been very badly hurt, even for a lifetime, paralysis and so forth, because of accidents that occurred during drinking games and other kinds of activities. I think if we just make it a more common part of our life, I have lived in Europe for extended periods, and I just don't see the problems in Europe that I see, especially in higher education today, with regard to the drinking age. So I am, and there are many college presidents. Anyone who's involved in higher education tends to think this way. I don't want to overly state it, but I'm not alone in the opinion.
Yeah. All right. And kind of moving somewhat similar, I don't want to compare them, but the opioid crisis. Yes. Can't compare them, they're two different beasts, but looking at the opioid, that's one of my words. Yep. Opioid crisis across the district and across the country. Yes. What are some ways in Congress you would hope to implement to possibly mitigate that issue? I think the opioid crisis is, for this district, it's actual number one issue. Yeah. I mean, I can say from a macro level it's tax reform and we need manufacturing and the economy and jobs. But the issue that touches everybody is this one. Yeah. My own cousin lost his son, 18-year-old beautiful boy last year.
This is an issue that also is symbolic as well as real for all of the other issues we touch, the hopelessness that young people feel, the lobbying efforts of pharmaceutical companies who have had an overbearing influence on bringing opiates into our society. And we still allow it to continue, even though we have known for centuries that opiates are inherently addictive. And the pharmaceutical companies and the presence that they have now in our entire country, not just in the medical profession, meet up with the illegal drug trade. So people who have been on opiates with no proper regulation by their physician, if they began out of a surgery or an accident or something, it's not properly regulated and monitored, they find themselves addicted, then they are cut off, and then they're out on the streets looking for heroin that is now being laced with fentanyl and even more lethal kinds of opiate drugs that are being obtained, by the way, through the internet and the dark web in international channels. This is a very corrosive aspect of our society. So how do we address it? I think we have to push hard back on the pharmaceutical companies. I think the states general in every state and the attorney general for the federal government should be aggressively pursuing the pharmaceutical companies in legal ways, and we would use that money into our health care for rehabilitation. I believe that our healthcare system and this opiate addiction can inform each other about the needs of this society, not only in terms of universal health care, but why we're using health care to help the society as a whole. The economic issue of hopelessness, an opportunity that might exist if we have more and better training from, say, our community colleges, private-public partnerships to move people in directions of jobs. And you know, not everyone needs or wants to be a college professor or a lawyer, for that matter. People can move into some very productive areas. Be a welder, be a plumber, be an electrician, be a contractor. Be part of something where you feel like you're contributing to society and using your own potential. Those are the kinds of partnerships that we want to foster. So if we can curb the pharmaceutical industry, if our law enforcement can be very focused on the dangerous illegal drugs and not on marijuana, which, by the way, I think should be legalized and regulated and taxed. So if law enforcement can focus on the massive corruption that goes on with an illegal drug trade, we might be able to close this terrible loop that has caught so many people and begin to move more productively again for our young people.
All right, switching issues to education.
Yes.
A huge macro discussion going on right now as to whether to invest more money in public schools or which many people would argue or would say is a iffy system that does need reforms, or to invest more money in practices like charter schools. Where do you stand on that spectrum, and how do you feel about the issue in general?
Well, as a product of both private and public education, although most of my education...
Primary and secondary, sorry.
Okay. Still, I would, and my children went to public schools here in the Ithaca school system. And my ex-husband and I were very proud to send them to public schools. It was part of the reason why we stayed in Ithaca. I would say that there still should be tax abatement for private institutions, but I would not pump a whole lot of other public money into private schools. I think we need to seriously take a look at our public school system and see what is ailing and try to address those issues rather than leave our public schools hung out to dry, facing tremendous challenges, many of them societal challenges that are very complex. Anything from drug trade to parents not having the training to nurture their children and socialize their children. So much of early elementary education, if you talk to people in Watkins, if you talk to people in any of the counties here, they say that what they're doing in elementary education is actually socializing a child. That the education can only come when the child can actually be present to what's going on in the classroom. So there are a lot of gaps that we need to look at in our public education, and I would prefer that our tax money go back into public education and not support private education. But I am not saying that private education should not exist.
Yeah. Switching to healthcare.
Yes.
Healthcare, from the last time we talked last
Yes.
week to
Yes.
today, we've already seen currently, as we sit here, the amendment process is taking place.
Yes.
I guess which frames the question perfectly. If you were in the Senate, which you're not running for Senate, but if
Right.
you were on the Senate floor right now, what would be your top priorities to amend healthcare and ensure remain in federal health policy?
Well, once you're in a body like the Senate or the House of Representatives, there is a certain amount of politics that one must play. So, ideally, I would like universal health care. I think it's the goal, practically, that we should all be working towards. If in order to achieve that, we have to work incrementally and fix the Affordable Care Act, and then keep moving on from there, then that is what I would pursue as a senator or as a representative.
Yeah.
But the goal is universal health care. Right now we have a system that is largely driven by the health maintenance organizations. And as I said in the previous video, the reason why the Senate proposals are not moving right now is because health maintenance organizations don't want them. It would destabilize the markets. But clearly, we still have not only problems with the high premiums within the Affordable Care Act, but we still have millions of people who don't have health care.
Yeah.
And at this day and age, in the 21st century, that is an inefficient and ineffective way to manage basic needs of people in a society. And I'm afraid we are wasting tremendous resources, both financial and otherwise, in the pendulum swing that we keep having on this issue. We need to settle it in one way or the other so that we can move on to the other pressing needs that we have.
Another issue, immigration, is one that was talked on and on from the beginning days of the 2016 election.
Yes.
To ask you, the district is largely agricultural,
Yes.
bringing a lot of migrant workers with
Yes.
the dairy industry,
Yeah.
especially.
In the wine industry.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. For you, what would be some ways to look at immigration policy to work with those constituencies in the district?
Well, under the Obama administration, I think there was a very good and reasonable immigration reform plan. President Trump is a master at branding, and if I could wave a wand, I would wave it over him, and he could take off the Obama label and put on Trump and push it through Congress and get us the proper kind of immigration reform that we need in the society today.
What are some specific details of that reform?
Right. Well, we certainly would allow the children of immigrants who have come in undocumented to be made citizens. And I think that there should be pathways for the people who are here and have been productive members of this society for some time. So yes, there's a population of people who come in on a migrant basis and then go back to other countries. There's also a very significant population of people who stay. So I can share with you a family that I know and have known now for 10 years that both parents are productive members. They are very, very hardworking people. They're originally from Mexico. They have 4 children. All of those children either have already gone and graduated college or are on that path. They've finished college in 4 years, which is not even the norm nowadays. It's 5 years. They have finished. They are productive members of society. And very recently, the father of this family was in a truck with someone who didn't have a seatbelt on. He has been detained. He is in Batavia detention for immigration, and he has been there for over a month now. He is not able to work. His workplace needs him and wants him. God knows his wife and his children need him and want him. This is absolutely wrong what we're doing. It's criminal.
Yeah.
He's not. What we're doing right now is wrong, and that has to be corrected.
Moving on to voting reform and campaign finance.
Yes.
Big issue brought up in 2016. A lot of grassroots groups, grassroots movements coming out and coming from different places on the campaign finance reform. What are some ways you would look at, if you would end up in Congress, that you would be able to reform existing laws and policies in that area?
Yeah, well, let's start right off with Citizens United. I join the millions of other people who think that Congress should effectively pass legislation that would overrule the Citizens United decision. For people who are unaware of how big money has perverted politics in the United States today, I would be happy to supply a reading list or a viewing list of documentaries. But we absolutely need finance reform. We need to, hopefully through the Supreme Court action in this next term, end political gerrymandering. So those would be the first two areas. Additionally, some of the political things that the Trump administration is doing right now, suggesting that there was fraud in this last election. The only fraud that there was that which helped him in terms of the Russian interference, which is documented by all of our intelligence agencies. Whether he wants to believe it or not is immaterial when you have the quality of individuals and administration and agencies that have documented the effect of that influence. Those kinds of reforms we have to go forward to be sure that our political process remains with as much integrity as it has had and which we can maintain. But moving into an era of the internet, and this is an area which professionally I know pretty well, there are tremendous soft spots that must be addressed, and we cannot move on to internet voting until we have addressed those areas. I preferably would rather go back to, say, postal voting before I would suggest that in the next election or in the next 5 elections, until we can address security the way we truly need to maintain that integrity. I would rather go back in time to something more secure than something that remains a challenge.
All right, now moving to some questions about you and your run in particular.
Okay.
So, district is largely rural, majority Republican, and you're the professor from Ithaca.
Right. And even worse, also a lawyer. I mean, it doesn't get much worse, Vaughn.
Well, looking at that, how do you think you're going to be able to relate to the area within the district?
Well,
or the eastern reaches.
Right. I mean, as I said last time, I'm not to the manor born. My father never graduated from high school. My mother did, and she would have loved to have gone on to college, but there were not the opportunities. So I'm very grateful for the education that I've received and the opportunities that I've had as a result, but I still feel like the best education I ever had was in my father's restaurant, to be quite honest. And I miss the broad spectrum of people that I interacted with in those years. And I'm looking forward to being out with other people and learning more about their lives. And I do mean the broadest spectrum of what that entails. I think moving forward in this district, and away from the deeply partisan politics in our culture today, I want to have conversations where I can understand, why, in my view, people in this district keep voting against their interests, their economic interests, most certainly. I would like to know if they believed that Trump was going to help them, let's say. Do they still believe that today? Is the tax system working for them? And if it's not, how and in what ways? Do they really believe that we can bring manufacturing back to this district or any other in the way that it existed in the 1950s when, you just have to kind of look around and know the world has changed. And maybe it's a little more effort to be re-educated or recertified or get retooling, but wouldn't it be better for adults and for their families and children to get the kind of education they need to be in a global information economy instead of just reverting back to something that was active 50 years ago? I want to ask people what's working for them, what ideas they have that can make things better. And as I learn and we have that conversation, I think I'll be able to sharpen some of my ideas as to what at the federal level, and that's what it would be, for a representative of Congress we could do to help people here.
And looking at the field of candidates as it is now,
Yes.
very large field, 5 have formally filed, and you are in the
Exploration
stage.
Yes.
So what do you think sets you apart from the other candidates and presents your niche in this race?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, again, I'm very grateful for the education I have, and I think that it gives me a perspective. I'll go back to the word you used. The education I have allows me to see things in a macro way. And while I know it's very important to be able to connect the macro down to a specific idea, a specific plan, a specific program, one thing, as I've listened to some of the other candidates, that I still feel like I have to offer is that I can see that larger picture and, importantly, how different issues intersect with each other. I think part of the problem of our legislative process and our political conversations is that we compartmentalize everything. We're going to fix health care. Well, what does that have to do with the economy? What does that have to do with the opioid crisis? What does it have to do with cultural questions about how we want to raise our children and the integrity of our families and our society? I think those things interrelate.
Yeah.
And I do believe that my education and my experience helps me see some of those interconnections. In particular, the work I've done in internet policy, I think, is very important to this community now. We have one of the least developed broadband deployments in all of New York State. And I know that Governor Cuomo wants to have universal broadband, and I applaud that effort, just as I do his program for universal health care within New York State. But these programs must be aligned with the federal government. We cannot expect New York State to pay for everything. We may as well separate from the rest of the country. We'll all be individual states, and we know that that is not going to work in this global economy, and that we really are going to be better if we all work together. So there has to be that necessary alignment between the federal government and the state government to create these goals. In addition to basic broadband deployment, the infrastructure, so to speak, I think my work as an educator in information literacy is critical, absolutely critical to the kind of educational reform that we need to have people able and available as they're going through school and once they graduate from school to participate in that global information economy.
And a question, if you would not win the primary, would you consider running as an independent in the general?
We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.
Yeah.
But I will say this. If I see another candidate that I believe represents the issues that I think are important and articulates them in a way that I think is useful to not only the Democratic Party, but independents, and to maybe that 5 to 10% of Republicans, the Trump bump, as people are now saying. If I see someone that I believe can do it better, I will turn in my keys.
Yeah.
But right now I don't, and I want to have this opportunity to see if I would be the person to serve the people in this district.
And kind of along those lines, if you would not win the primary, is there kind of something you want to leave behind with your race, something people want to remember you by moving forward into the general?
Sure. I'm kind of repeating myself now at this point, but I do believe that tax reform is the largest issue because it's something that has been going on for a long time. We must address it. We must settle the issues of health care, and we have to deal with the opioid crisis because that's what's affecting people every single day in our community and around the country, but absolutely also in our community. I think the work that I've done on internet policy and the understanding that I have of its relationship to all these other issues, e-health, e-manufacturing, an information economy, e-governance, e-commerce, education, I hope other people, whether I win or not, would adopt that lens because that's the only way this country is going to move forward. I'm sure of that.
Well, that's all I have, and our time is just about up.
Okay.
So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Juan.